I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts, and welcome back to the Night Sky Sew Along. This week we are going to work on sewing half blocks using the directions on page 9 in your pattern. Let's get started. Now that I have my triangle units pieced, I'm going to go ahead and begin to sew them together into half blocks. So I'm going to start with two pieces that have different inside fabrics. You'll notice they have the same exterior fabrics. So we're going to put those two together and sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam. When I put them right sides together, it can be helpful to pin. This is a personal choice. If you don't want to pin here, you don't have to, but it can be helpful. I want to line this up, and I'm going to peel it back and make sure that this is a straight line here, and go ahead and put a pin in. And then the other place that I want to check my alignment is up here. I want to make sure these are perfectly on top of each other so that my points look great. So I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in right here. And I'm putting my pins far enough in that I won't need to remove them while I'm sewing. I can wait until I reach the end to remove them. So slow and steady, especially at the beginning, because we've got a couple seams coming together there. Make sure that my bottom points align as well. I'm just going to sew my scant 1/4 inch seam. I'm just going to sew onto a little scrap of a leader ender here so I can take that piece off and we can take a look at it. So snip that off, take out our pins, and let's see how it looks. And that looks great. We now have our point is inset 1/4 inch from both directions so that when we sew our frame on, we won't lose that lovely point that we've worked so hard for, and everything lines up here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to finger press this open, and I'm also going to use my seam roller, and then I'm going to head over to the iron and press this as well so that I make sure that it's nice and flat before I go ahead and add my next piece. I'm at my pressing station, and I'm going to go ahead and press this seam nice and flat before I add the third pieced triangle unit. Just a reminder from last week, pressing is up and down. We don't want to go like this. We have a lot of bias that we're working with and we don't want to stretch it. So we just want to go lightly up and down. Now that we have this pressed, go ahead and add my third pieced triangle unit. Gone ahead and press that nice and flat. And I'm going to go ahead now and take my third piece, which is going to be the same inside color as my first piece, and line that up. And you want to make sure that you don't accidentally put this one here and have the same one next to each other. You want to make sure that you're going every other with your interior fabrics. And the alignment of this piece is going to be very similar. I'm going to flip that together, and it's going to line up with this dog ear here from sewing our first piece. I'm going to go ahead and put those same two pins in. Line this up, peel this back, and adjust as needed to make sure that those seams are right on top of each other. I'm going to repeat that up here, line those up, peel it back, check, put a pin in. You might also find it's helpful at this point to add a third pin down here to make sure that this stays lined up, this triangle right on top of that triangle. Put a third pin in down here. And go ahead and sew my scant 1/4 inch seam. And let's see how this looks. Take out those pins. You never want to sew over pins, so make sure that they're far enough in or that you remove them as you go. And there we go. Again, our points are 1/4 inch in. And as you can see, if you look really close, things are off a tiny bit here, but that's within my margin of what I'm comfortable. If not, I would go ahead and undo this seam to correct that. I'm going to go ahead and press that, and then I'm going to take my other 3 triangles and make the other half of my block. And since this half of my block is the mineral, hex, mineral, this half of my block is going to be the opposite. It's going to be hex, mineral, hex, so that when I put them together to make a complete block, I have every other print. I now have my 2 halves pieced, and I'm going to go ahead and press my final seams. I've used my seam roller to open them up. And just as I did with the first ones, I'm just going to give it a light press. Make sure I don't iron and push anything, stretch my bias. Just a good press. So there's my 1 half. And let's do my other half. It can be tempting at this point now to want to sew these together, but that's not the way that this quilt is constructed. Instead of sewing these together, we're going to now focus on the frame fabric. And the frame fabric is going to go around these 3 sides and these 3 sides. Use the directions on page 3 of your pattern to cut the appropriate frame width for the size quilt that you're making. I'm making a baby quilt, so I have wide frames. There are 3 different widths depending on which quilt you're making. Make sure that you cut your frame pieces accordingly. Before adding the frame pieces, it's important to evaluate your blocks and be sure that the side of your half block, where it will meet another half block, is as straight as possible. For example, with these 2, you can see that they are closer in the center than they are on the outside. If your pieces bow slightly, like this, or like this, it means that you sewed with either a seam allowance that was too scant or too generous, or that your bias stretched along the way. Slight variations, such as this, can be accommodated when putting your quilt together. Significant variations, such as this, cannot. Take a look at your blocks now to see if you have any issues and remake blocks if necessary. Do not trim this straight if you notice that it's slightly wiggled like this or slightly bowed. If you trim this straight, you will end up trimming too close to this point and you'll lose your point when you put your 2 half blocks together. As noted with this one, slight variations like this can be accommodated when we put the entire quilt top together. So the next step is to add the frame pieces. These are blocks for another quilt I'm working on. This is the block that I'm working on today. And I'm going to go ahead and take my 8-inch piece. It's 8 inches regardless of the width. And I'm going to put my 8-inch piece onto this block. Put those right sides together, and I'm going to flip and sew from this side. I'm going to do that for 2 reasons. 1, by flipping it, I can see the points and make sure that I don't lose them. And by flipping it, I can make sure that I avoid stretching this bias. The piece that is on the bottom when you sew tends to stretch more than the piece on the top. You may notice this if you've ever sewn 2 very long strips together, that the bottom one ends up being slightly longer. It's how the feed dogs in the machine are set up. So as a result, I want to make sure I don't stretch this top piece that has bias. This piece has straight of grain, won't stretch as much. So I'm going to place this on top, make sure I line up my raw edges. I'm going to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam, being careful to make sure I don't lose my points. And I have centered this along, so I have about a 1/2 inch, give or take, on either side of my piece. If you have a stiletto, this is a good opportunity to use it to make sure that you keep your seams from flipping and your fabric from slipping. Slow when you reach your points. We've worked very hard to make these blocks, and the last thing we want to do is end up sewing off of our points when adding our frame fabric. I'm going to repeat for the other half of the block. Again, I'm going to flip it right sides together with my block, my half block on top. I'm going to center it, line up my raw edges perfectly, and sew my scant 1/4 inch seam. Normally I press my seams open, but in this case, since I have bulk on this side and not on this side, I'm going to go ahead and press this to the frame. So I'm going to head over to my iron and carefully press this, making sure not to stretch any bias along the way. I have now carefully pressed my frame fabric away from my block, being careful not to stretch the bias that still remains on the other outside two sides of my block. The next step is to trim off the excess frame fabric so that I can sew on the next two sides. We're going to use our sidekick ruler to do that. Simply going to take the sidekick ruler, line up this side of the ruler and this side of the ruler along here and along my frame piece, and trim. Then I'm going to rotate my block and do the same thing over here. I'm going to repeat that on this piece. And if you are left-handed, place your ruler like this, trim, place your ruler like this, and trim. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to do this right-handed. Now when we put this piece on, we centered it, but that's not what we want to do with the next two pieces. We want to make sure that there is enough hanging down here to cut this horizontal. If we center this, we're going to end up with too much up here and we're not going to have enough to have a point here. So we want to make sure that we arrange both of these so that they're just 1/4 inch past up here. And again, when we head to the machine, we're going to make sure that we sew this from the back so that we don't lose any of our points and we avoid stretching bias. I'm back at my machine and ready to piece my remaining frame pieces onto my half block. And as mentioned, I want to make sure that I have about 1/4 inch up here and the bulk of my fabric hanging down towards the middle of my half block so that I have enough to trim this straight after sewing it on. It can be easy to accidentally align this in the wrong place. So as a result, I've gone ahead and pinned as shown here. Now I'm just going to go ahead and sew my scant 1/4 inch along these two sides. And slow when I get to the point. And it's okay if I am a little bit further from the point here, as my background fabric is the same as my frame fabric. I just want to make sure that I don't sew and snip onto the point. So if you have a little bit of a gap here, if your seam allowance is a little bit too generous over here, that's okay. And I should say, when I say too generous, I mean if this seam allowance was too generous, not the seam you're sewing right now. You want to make sure you're sewing your accurate scant 1/4 inch now, but if this point is more than 1/4 inch in from there, that's okay. We don't want to trim this. We never want to trim with these patterns. And I almost aligned it wrong there, so I'm just going to go ahead, line it up and pin it again because I want to make sure my excess is hanging off there. It's real easy to do that wrong. Luckily, if you do it wrong, when you flip it and press it, you'll notice before you trim, and you can unpick it and fix it. I've completed sewing my frame, and as you can see, if I finger press it, I sewed it correctly, so I'll have enough down here to trim off and there. So I'm going to head on over to the iron and press these, and I'm going to make sure that I don't pull at this when I'm at the iron. You can very easily stretch the bias in this piece when pressing this here. So it's important to finger press this first and make sure that you don't press it with your iron and pull it with your iron and accidentally stretch this bias. So I'm just going to gently finger press and then head on over to the iron. So now to complete my half block, I need to trim off my excess. Repeat the steps that we did to trim the ends of this one off, up here and up here. We want to make sure that we maintain this 60-degree angle, so it's important that we use our ruler to help us. We don't want to accidentally get turned around. And now to cut off these, we're going to use the sharp point of our sidekick ruler. And again, we're going to align this side, and we're going to align this side. And we're going to make sure that this point is 1/4 inch in and lines up on our dashed line as well. So there's 3 things we're checking with our alignment here. I'm going to trim. I'm going to repeat that step at the top. Line up here, here, and make sure our point is at least 1/4 inch in. Now the next step is optional, but it will help you put your half blocks together to assemble your quilt next week. I suggest trimming off the sharp points at the ends of the blocks. And that is done by taking this part of the ruler and aligning it here, and the triangle line and aligning it on this edge. So we line up that here, we line up that there, and trim. And what that will do is that will give us an alignment point to align to the next block. So I'm going to repeat that here. And again, this is optional, and if you'd like, you can wait until next week to see more, but I highly suggest it, especially if you're at all apprehensive about putting your half blocks together. So if you're left-handed, you're going to place your ruler up here, here, and here. Trim, make sure you're 1/4 inch in. Down here, that's going to look like this. And then for these, it's going to look like this and like this. So now go ahead and sew the frame fabric onto all of your half blocks and trim them as shown. Thanks so much for tuning in here today. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it, share your comments with us, and subscribe to this channel. You can also turn on notifications for this channel to receive an alert when new videos are available. We'd love to see your night sky quilt half blocks. Please share a photo with us on social media using #NightSkyQuilt so that we can see your progress. Thanks again, and we'll see you back here next week to work on turning these half blocks into a quilt top.